How to make, or how I made, this mid-century inspired TV console. Let's get into it. I started by squaring the raw lumber using the jointer, planer, and table saw. Then, using sets of 2 and 3 planks, I glued together the panels that would make up the top, bottom, sides, and supports of the cabinet, creating 6 panels in total. Using cauls helped reduce the cupping during glue-ups. Once the panels were glued, I cut them down to dimension. I'll leave the exact specs in the description below. To add a little cohesive design flair and match the other cabinet and shelving unit I made, link in the top right, I added a 10-degree slope to what would be the rightmost side panel. With all the panels to size and shape, I set the gouge bit to make 2 1/8-inch deep grooves in the bottom panel to hold the sliding doors. I measured and marked my guideline to ensure the front groove would be an inch back from the edge and only extend 5 feet down the long panels. To get the 3/4 inch width, took 2 adjacent passes. I then set the gouge bit to 1/4 inch to cut the 2 matching grooves in the top panel. These are deeper to allow the doors to be slightly lifted and then removed as needed. With that done, I set about making the jig for the dowel joints that would connect all of the panels together to form the cabinet. I marked the faces and the inner and outer edge of this squared offcut so I could easily track how to cut matching mortises to connect the panels. Setting a line 3/8 of an inch from the edge, I marked and cut 6 pilot holes. Then, use the jig to create all the mortises for those joints. I definitely heard your feedback from the cabinet shelving unit video and debated switching up the joint to something more durable, like a dovetail, but decided to keep these side-to-side pieces cohesive and simply upped the number of dowels I used. With those in place, I cut datas in the 2 rightmost panels to provide a slot for a small shelf. Since I don't own a dado blade, I used the table saw to rip the outer edges, then the router to clear the inner excess. The last thing I needed to do before glue-ups was round the front-facing right corners of the top and bottom panels. So I measured and marked a 5-inch square from each corner, placed the pin of my circle cutting jig 5 inches from the edge of the blade, and then placed that pin at the intersection of my measurements. Then started cutting. After that, we were finally ready for glue up. While you watch me pretend like this glue up isn't stressing me out, I'd like to invite you to like, subscribe, and ring the bell if you'd like a heads up when I post my next video. I'm learning as I go, so I love hearing from you guys, and I'm always dreaming up new projects. Okay, back to my facade. With the cabinet framework square and gluing, I got to work on the shelf for the dado slots. To get the exact dimensions so the shelf would fit perfectly in the slot, I used measuring sticks. Then, cut the panel down to size. And of course, rounded the corner to match the top and bottom cabinet panels. With that roughed in, I moved to making the sliding doors next. After marking their order, I glued 2 sets of 5 planks together to form the panels. And once dry, cut them down to size. Then got to work on the lattice detail, using the ripsaw to cut the frame pieces and the thin lattice strips. For the frame, I used mitered corners. Then cut all the thin strips down to length. To make sure all the lap joints of the lattice were all exactly the same, I taped the 2 long pieces together with the long frame pieces before cutting. After setting the blade height to half the depth of the strips, I got to work sneaking up on the joint markings. I did the exact same thing to the short strips. Then glued all the pieces together. Once that was glued and sanded down a bit, I needed to place it in the door. Thanks to all of you guys' insights, this time I upped my game and used tongue and grooves to situate the lattice in the panel, ensuring a better adhesion than end grain to long grain, and better accounting for wood movement. So thanks, guys. While that dried, I started in on the feet of the cabinet, jointing, planing, and cutting the feet, skirts, and stretchers all down to size. Of course, I made all of these cuts before realizing I wanted to try a kind of dovetailed slot to join them all. So I had to throw that out the window and settle for dowels once more, again, to match the first unit in the pair. I made myself another jig and set about cutting the mortises. I waited to cut the tapers in the feet until after cutting the mortises, as I figured it would be easier to keep everything square. I applied a similar logic to cutting the feet down to their final lengths as well. With everything all ready, I rounded over all the edges. Then gave them all a nice finishing level sand down before glue up. I had to take the actual glue up in stages, given the length of the unit and the length of my clamps did not exactly match up, so I did one side at a time. To link the second side to the first required some creative clamping to keep everything level. But we all survived, and once the feet were ready, I used countersinks and screws to join them to the cabinet. Don't forget, I still have to finish up the doors. Once the lattice was glued, I needed to cut the door back down to the right dimension. Then started working on the door pull details. I cut the hand sketch design out with my bandsaw, then rounded over all the edges and used a ball gouge to cut away what would be used for the actual pull. Then used a straight edge gouge to create a slight lip for each pull to assist with the better glue up to the door panel. After sanding away the roughness, I glued them together. The final piece of the massive puzzle was the interior shelf. For the sake of not watching another glue up, let's jump to cutting out the slots for the dividers. I used the router to get the job done. And again to cut away the slot on the underside of the shelf to make space for the adjustable pegs. To make the dividers, I simply cut a 6-inch wide plank down to size, then added a 45-degree slope in the front-facing side. After another bout of pre-finishing, I glued them into place. With all the gluing now done, it was time to work towards final finishes. First, I rounded over the top edge of the console. To fill some insect damage on the lumber, I used a little bit of epoxy. And with that dry, it was time to start sanding. And sanding. And sanding. Then, a little local finish to seal it up. I like to add the finish before placing the adjustable shelf pins to avoid drip mess or compromising the mortises. And that's a wrap. Thanks so much for watching. If If you want a heads up when I post my next video, subscribe and ring the bell. I'm already knee-deep in new projects that I can't wait to share with you. Until next time.